WBAI commentator for many years. Is a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, and she directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, and thank goodness there is an Institute for Policy Studies, otherwise K Street would be more of a desert than it is. She's helped to found and remains on the steering committee of the U.S. Campaign to End Israeli Occupation, a group with which Brooklyn for Peace is affiliated. She works closely with United for Peace and Justice, the anti-war coalition with which we are also affiliated. She co-chairs the UN-based International Coordinating Network on Palestine. She's played an active role in the peace movement for many years, far more than is listed in her biography. And she continues to serve as an advisor to several top UN officials on Mideast and democratization issues. She's really a wonderful analyst, and I hope you will give her your rapt attention.
I was in Iowa for a few days. I was talking in Ames and in Des Moines. I went to see Occupy Des Moines, which was a very inspiring site.
Are you using microphones?
I think I am. Yes. Not enough? Let's see if we can do something. Let's see if this works. Any better? How's that?
Good, yeah, it's better.
Much better? Okay, I'm not going to start all over again, though. If you missed it, sorry. It was just a, love song to Brooklyn. So, what was I saying? I was in Iowa. So I was in Des Moines, and I was in Ames, and a few other places talking about the usual stuff. But one of the events I did, which was in Ames at the university, was for some, special lecture series, and the title that they gave it was The Arab Spring, How Can We Help? And I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting notion, because I think they were thinking of it in the context of what can the U.S. do? What would be the U.S. policy that would be the most useful? Me, I wasn't thinking about it so much that way. I was thinking about what can we do? We people, ordinary people, citizens, civil society, all of that. But it made me think about that, and I realized that the first answer to that very crucial question, what can we do to help, is end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, stop our government from militarizing and preventing the Arab Spring from moving forward, and stop U.S. support for the Israeli occupation and apartheid. That seemed pretty easy. It was like, okay, now can I go home, But we're talking now at a moment of, it's a rather extraordinary moment. We have a huge victory to claim as our own. It's an incomplete victory, but it's still enormous. And that is the announcement of the withdrawal of troops from Iraq. That is our collective victory. This is not something the Obama administration wanted. Despite all the election stuff about I will end the war in Iraq, and oh yeah, by the way, I will escalate the war in Afghanistan. That's the promise he kept, yes. But there was a lot of claimed interest in ending the war in Iraq, but at the same time, the military was having none of it. The military's line was, we gotta stay. We got things to do. We're not done here. So, okay, they had a lot to do, and a lot of what they had to do involved what militaries always do, killing people and breaking things, right? So, in that context, the fact that President Obama listened to us, the people, who now in the 75% or so range have been saying, get out of Iraq now, that this is not a war worth fighting, is a real victory. Now, we didn't do this victory alone. The victory belongs to the global peace movement, the U.S. movement, and especially to the people of Iraq, who have been so incredibly clear about not wanting the continuation of the U.S. occupation. Some of that opposition obviously took a military form. A lot of it took a non-military form. But it was strong enough that the U.S.-backed, corrupt, weak government in Baghdad didn't have a whole lot of choice. He knew he could not get public support, so he didn't try to keep the troops there. Ironically, this is a situation where both the U.S. president and the Iraqi prime minister, they really want to keep U.S. troops there. They both have an interest in it. But the people in both countries, oops, not so much. So the problem they faced was, how do we do what we want when our people don't want us to? On both sides. So they both are saying, we must end this war, right? But for the moment, let's just keep a few troops here. Maliki, of course, wants U.S. troops because it's not at all clear that his government will survive without those troops. Now, I'm not convinced that would be the worst thing in the world. His government is nothing to write home about. But it is kind of where the dependency lies. He couldn't even get the support of his parliament, let alone the people, to support what would be necessary to keep the US troops. The US wants to keep the troops for the military reasons, but they couldn't do that unless they get the Iraqis to agree to something called immunity, right? Iraq was having none of that because they knew what the US troops did with immunity over the last 8 years, and it wasn't a very pretty sight. Immunity means if the US troops are there, they're not accountable to Iraq, to the Iraqi justice system, they're not accountable to Iraqi civilians. They can do whatever they want to Iraqis. They can kill, maim, rape, torture, as they've done for 8 years, and they wouldn't be held accountable. So the US position was, without immunity, we're not staying. And the Iraqi position was, well, we really want you to stay. Can't you kind of reconsider? We can kind of fudge it. Nope, we want immunity. After all, we had immunity for 8 years. We're not giving it up now. That's what they couldn't agree on. So guess what? The agreement that George Bush was forced into signing with Iraq back in November of 2008, in his last months in office, is actually going to be implemented. That's huge. That's a huge victory. Now, let's talk about why it's not an all-sided, comprehensive victory. Because even if they abide by the letter of that agreement, the SOFA it's called, the Status of Forces Agreement, and pull out all the troops by the end of this year, there's about a little less than 40,000 left, and all the Pentagon-paid mercenaries, Pentagon-paid contractors, that's about 70 to 100,000 at any given moment. Even if they did all of that, there's a little glitch in the language of the SOFA that says we have to withdraw all the troops and all the Pentagon-paid contractors, but it doesn't say anything about contractors paid by somebody else, like the State Department, for instance. So what do we see going on at the State Department? A massive, quick move to sign a bunch of contracts so that all these contractors can stay in Iraq, do the same thing they're doing, rape, pillage, mayhem, whatever, but they won't be paid by the Pentagon, so it won't be a violation. How's that for good lawyers? So we need to keep the pressure on to pull all of them out. We're building, as you all know, the biggest embassy in the history of the world. It's going to have 5,000 people. Of those 5,000 people, more than 4,000 are there for security. There will be 16,000 at least, that's the number we're hearing about, State Department paid contractors to provide security and more. So it's not quite an end to the war. But I think we do need to claim it as our own, as a victory, that the best they're going to be able to come up with by their standards, wanting the war and the occupation to continue as is, the best they can do is to have a few thousand State Department contractors running around the country. That's a pretty good victory. It's not complete, but it's a pretty good victory for us. I'll get to questions after, okay? So that's kind of the context in which we're looking at what's happening with the Arab Springs that are springing up all around the world. There are a lot of problems right now in the Arab Spring, but it is still a thoroughly exciting, incredible, far-out, wonderful, huge thing that's happening. It is a revolutionary process that has incredible potential to transform this region. Now, is it a guarantee that the region is going to come out of this fabulous? No guarantees in life. But when you're talking about the overthrow of primarily US-backed dictators, that can only be a good thing. That can only be a good thing. What comes next is going to be really, really hard. What comes already in the ones that are still underway, really hard. What comes after in the ones where there's been an initial victory, like Egypt and Tunisia, is going to be really, really scary. Tunisia's election this last weekend has been fantastic. We don't know all the results yet. The initial results are that it will probably be a coalition government between the mainstream Islamist party and the mainstream sort of semi-progressive, more or less secular party. That's not bad. Together, it seems, those two parties had somewhere in the area of 60 to 70% of the vote. That's not bad for a coalition government, and they're already talking to each other. None of this sectarian stuff. That's a good model. These are fundamental challenges to U.S. strategy in the region. I mean, look what the US gave up in Iraq. The US didn't succeed in its war. This war was about a bunch of things. It was about making sure that all Iraqi oil contracts were going to be won by US oil companies. Didn't happen. It's about making sure that Iraq remains a country that is pro-US both in its population and its government and anti-Iranian. Didn't happen. This was a war designed to make sure that the US could continue to use Iraq permanently for permanent bases and as a launching pad for attacking Iran. Didn't happen. They couldn't pull it off. So this is a huge defeat for those goals of the US wars. And at the same time, it's a huge victory for those who said that this war was never going to make Iraqis safer, it was never going to make us safer, it was never going to end terrorism, that was all a lie, and that was really about power and oil and the expansion of US empire. There were more than 500 US bases in Iraq during the war. They now have 18, and they're scrambling to get rid of those 18 by the time the troops leave at the end of the year. That's amazing. That's amazing. That's a huge victory. So what else is going on in the region? We're looking at a region where the wars are still going on. The war in Iraq is not over yet. The commitment is there, but it ain't over till it's over, and it ain't over yet. In Afghanistan, there are still 100,000 US troops, 100,000 Pentagon-paid mercenaries slash contractors slash whatever you want to call them, doing military work, 20,000 of them armed, officially security people, the other 80,000 helping the military ones, and between 40 and 50,000 additional NATO troops. That's almost 250,000 military people in the interests of the US NATO occupation. That's what's still going on in Afghanistan. We're not even hearing a promise to withdraw them all by 2014. How many of you thought that there was a commitment to ending the war in Afghanistan by 2014? Yeah, sorry, ain't true. What is true is there was a commitment to draw down by 2014. Oh, that's a good name. So we won't have 250,000 military people occupying Afghanistan. Maybe we'll have 30,000, maybe 45, maybe 20, but this ain't over till it's over, and it ain't over yet. So that's one of the things that we have to keep our focus on. The challenge to President Obama, and this is a challenge he took on for himself in his incredible speeches. This is a man who can talk the talk. Walk the walk, not so much. But on occasion, he can talk the talk like nobody's business. And in one of his speeches recently, he talked about the US position as a friend of democracy. We are the ones who stand with the fruit sellers against those with raw power. That's an amazing thing to say. The fruit seller who in Tunisia sparked the Arab Spring when he set himself ablaze and killed himself out of the utter frustration of humiliation and economic depredations under which he lived. And for the US to say, we stand with the fruit sellers against those with raw power, that's huge. The problem is, how's he supposed to do that when those with, quote, raw power, to use his own term, are our guys? Let's not forget Gaddafi was our guy until about a week ago. Well, actually that's not true, until about 5 months ago. But until the Arab Spring came to Libya, and people made what I happen to think was a somewhat fatal mistake in asking for military intervention, Gaddafi was our guy. The US didn't need to go to war in Libya to control the oil. We had all the oil contracts we needed. The Europeans had more, the Italians especially. I mean, but it wasn't only about the oil. Remember, as of 2002, 2003, Libya had been, quote, brought in from the cold. So what did that mean? It means that there had been new negotiations. Gaddafi had agreed to pay reparations to the families of the Lockerbie bombing. There were clear moves to disarm his nascent nuclear program. He had promised new political and diplomatic relations with the West. He was our guy, and there are pictures all over the internet to prove it. Arm in arm with President Obama, arm in arm with President Bush, arm in arm, notably with Condoleezza Rice, I'm not going there, arm in arm with Berlusconi, with Tony Blair, with all these guys. He was our guy. So what's the deal? Why do we have to go to war? Well, look at the geography. I wish I had a map, but I don't. So imagine the geography. You all know the basic geography of North Africa. Here's Libya, surrounded by Egypt and Tunisia, right? In the throes of the Arab Spring. in the throes of overthrowing US-backed dictators. So what's going to happen to Libya in the middle of all that? And for the Europeans, of course, there's a racist undercurrent of anti-immigrant stuff about, oh my God, are all those Libyans going to come here? Bad enough we're going to have these Tunisians and Egyptians and whatever. So there's a bunch of reasons why there's worry. Even though Gaddafi's our guy, he's also mercurial, he's kind of a nut job as seen in Washington. So what are we going to do if he changes his mind? I mean, after all, he wasn't our guy for a very long time. He's been our guy for not very long. So what are we going to do? Well, the Europeans decide they're going to go to war. Starts with the French and then the Brits. The French in particular, Sarkozy was freaked out because his Poles were in the basement, partly because of what he had done and not done about the Arab Spring in Tunisia, former French colony, right? Suddenly the spring of democracy hits the former French colony, and what does France do? It embraces the former dictator. Oops, bad planning, bad planning. So he's stuck, and he's trying to get back his popularity, right? What better way to do it than to be the first one out of the box to support the Libyan uprising? We stand with the people of Libya against whatever. And then the Brits do the same thing. Cameron wasn't doing so good on the foreign policy side of things either. So they go ahead and they move to the Security Council. They're going to get a resolution passed to get the proposal approved to go to war against Libya in the name of the whole world. The whole world stands with Libya. The whole world, frankly, was not so keen on this idea. But frankly, nobody asked the whole world. So that was sort of the goal. So they draft this resolution calling for a no-fly zone. In the meantime, people in Libya have taken up arms almost immediately after the Arab Spring emerges there. And very quickly, way too quickly, I'm afraid, they start asking for international support. First they don't. First they say, we don't want any international support, we can do it ourselves. There was a big banner across one of the roundabouts in Tripoli saying, we can do it on our own. It was a very powerful image. Then there was a bit of a shift and they started saying, well, we don't want foreign intervention, but we do want a no-fly zone. Well, the problem was everybody knew you can't have one without the other. The US generals, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all these guys were saying, this is a bad idea. A no-fly zone, number one, isn't going to work. Why? For among other reasons, the people of Libya were not being threatened by Gaddafi's planes, they were being threatened by his tanks. It wasn't about air power at all, except for ours. But that wasn't the only issue. The other issue was, if we're going to do a no-fly zone, we have to start by bombing Libya. It's an attack on Libya, and everybody needs to understand that. So that's what our generals were saying. So they get this resolution draft from the Brits and the French at the Security Council. They're saying, we're not supporting this. But instead of saying, oh, we don't support this? Okay, sorry, we're going to vote no. Not how it works. After all, Britain and France are our allies. And they are especially important allies where? Afghanistan. Where are there massive public levels of opposition? Where is there massive public opposition to the role of their governments in supporting the US in Afghanistan? Britain and France. So what is the US worried about? Britain and France might pull out of Afghanistan, not a good plan. We better figure out a way to support them in, where? Libya. So what do? Instead of just saying, no, we can't accept this, this isn't going to work, we're going to vote no. They come back to the Security Council and say, give us the draft. We'll rewrite the draft. Really? Okay. So they rewrite the draft. Thank you. What is this? A scotch? Just checking.
That's it. You look like a single wall.
This is Brooklyn. Anything is possible. Thank you. It's apple juice.
Dark.
I was looking for single malt. So, where was I? Oh, Libya, right. Yeah. It's really not single malt. So, the resolution gets passed. Through a lot of sleight of hand, they get the Arab League, half the Arab League, in fact. Half the Arab League wasn't invited to the meeting. The Arab League has 22 members, 12 of them were at the meeting. 10 out of the 12 voted to support a UN resolution calling for intervention in Libya. The other 10 weren't even invited to the meeting, 2 voted against. It was really ugly. The African Union was seen as useless because they were seen as being in Gaddafi's pocket. largely true. Gaddafi had thrown huge amount of money at sub-Saharan African countries, much of which went to important infrastructure projects, roads, clinics, schools, all the real stuff, and a huge amount of which, of course, went into the pockets of corrupt African government officials at virtually every level. So there was a huge showdown in the international community. France and Britain win out with US support. China and Russia reluctantly agree they won't stop it. They don't support it, they won't vote for it, but they abstain, allowing it to go through. So it's a mess, but supposedly it's a legal mess. And then all of a sudden we find out that the wording of the resolution doesn't just say a no-fly zone, it says a no-fly zone and all necessary measures. That's the crucial language. All necessary measures to protect civilians. Now it doesn't say protect which civilians, against whom, for how long, with what weapons. You know, I had a letter published in the Washington Post a few weeks ago, because in one of these background articles, which was otherwise quite good, in fact, they had described, and that not as a quote attributed to anybody, but just as a statement of fact in this article by the Post, they described the UN resolution as calling for protection of civilians from the Libyan government. I was like, no, it didn't say that. It said, protect Libyan civilians, period, full stop. So I wanted to know who was going to protect the Libyan civilians in Sirte, which the US and NATO were bombing with a vengeance. But they weren't being threatened by Gaddafi's forces, they were being threatened by our forces. Who's going to protect them? So this was a really serious breach of any rational understanding of what the role of the UN Charter is when it talks about ending the scourge of war. This turned the Arab Spring in Libya into a civil war, with the US and NATO on one side. And now they've won the military battle. Where it goes from here, I think we are very far from knowing. There is certainly a chance that a post-Gaddafi Libya, wealthy as it is, may emerge as a fantastic state for its own people, with a democratic government as defined by them. But I think that's really unlikely. We are seeing a greater level of divisions within Libya that has been seen for 42 years or more. The divide between East and West. So how many of you saw TV coverage of the celebrations 3 or 4 days ago when they announced the quote, liberation of Libya? It was, some of you did, it was a huge gathering. I'm guessing 300,000 or 400,000 people. This was not a rent-a-mob. These were people passionately thrilled with the overthrow of Gaddafi. There is no question about that. But they were in Benghazi, the eastern capital, which had been the centerpiece of the uprising. And the question then is, what if they had held that ceremony in Tripoli? How would the balance of popular support have looked differently? What if it was in Sirte, Gaddafi's old hometown, from which numerous civilians fled to get away from the fighting? Not all of them were Gaddafi supporters by any means, but clearly many of them were. They are going to come back to a city that has been devastated, where houses were looted and then burned to the ground, and then the city bombed by NATO over 2 brutal weeks. They are going to come back to catastrophe. So the question of how to rebuild when the so-called National Transitional Council has very little support at home. The militias have made clear we're not accountable to those guys. We liberated the country, they didn't. There's tremendous antagonisms already among the militias, between the militias and the TNC. It's a mess. It's a mess. And we don't know how it's going to play out. But the US is cheering him on. That always makes me nervous. And we'll see. Libya, I think, remains a very open case. The other parts of the Arab Spring, I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I would say that the situation in Yemen is moving further in the interests of democracy. The dictatorship, US-backed for all these years, you know, the US counted on him to allow us free rein to commit murder of Yemeni citizens as well as American citizens across Yemen with our drones. It's not likely that any new government is going to allow that, and the US knows it. So while they're talking the talk about supporting the democratic forces, they are doing nothing to undermine the power of the regime. In Bahrain, it's even worse. The US is bolstering that regime, talking a little bit once in a while about, oh, well, we wish that they would engage in serious reforms. Oh, okay, well, your wishes are worth a whole lot when you've got the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain. You know, what they're not doing is saying, just for starters, you're repressing your own people, you're slaughtering people in the streets. Our Fifth Fleet does not want to be hosted by that kind of a government. Bye-bye. But we're not about to see that. In Syria, it's a very dangerous moment. We're hearing far too much debate about, doesn't Libya, the great success of Libya, this is being viewed as a success, remember, doesn't that mean that we should do the same thing in Syria? Now, I don't think that they're serious about that. I don't think the generals in the US certainly know better than to think that they could move on Syria in the same way. There is no government in exile in Syria. There is no revolutionary movement calling for foreign intervention. There is not and will not be Arab League endorsement, and the Security Council is not on your life going to pass this one. So whether the US and NATO are prepared to pull a Kosovo, where they decide, oh, we can't get support from the UN Security Council, so we'll send it up to the NATO High Command. Let them make the decision. Really? That's like the hammer and the nail thing. You know, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're NATO, everything needs intervention, right? I mean, this is like a no-brainer. And then there's the other Arab states we're not hearing too much about yet, the other monarchies. We're not hearing much about Saudi yet, but I say yet because I think at some point we will. The Jordanian king has been smarter than most. He's given certain levels of easing up on some of the laws. There's no call for overthrowing that monarchy. It's rather popular. But there are huge calls in Jordan that are continuing for reforms. It's a wild time in the region, and nobody is really sure where is it going to pop up next. Is it going to be against a US-backed monarchy? Is it going to be against Algeria? Is it going to be in Morocco? We don't know. Lebanon? Who knows? I mean, this could happen anywhere. In the meantime, the idea that US-backed military dictatorships can rule the world in the Middle East is pretty much last week. It's pretty much over. They're going to need a whole new strategy.